जब तक असी जिंदा तुसी भी जिंदा हो जब 80 मर गए तो फिर उसकी जिम्मेवारी साड़ी नहीं
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to day 7 of Partition 73, our 16-day program to explore the partition of 1947 from as many perspectives as we can in these few days. It's hard to believe that we're almost halfway through, and we've already been to Hyderabad and Lahore, and we've heard some personal experience. We've been through classical music. We've talked about architecture. We went on a whirlwind tour of Pakistan yesterday with Sumaya Usmani, who I think left us all very hungry at the end. And I know I, for one, jumped on a food delivery app just afterwards and ordered some kebabs for dinner. So I don't know if she made anybody else feel like they absolutely had to have kebabs yesterday, but we definitely felt that way after that. And today we are again looking at a different experience of partition. And I think one of the things that I'm very grateful to our guests today is for taking the custodianship of the history. There is a much longer history in Asia, in Africa, in Australasia of oral history, where history was passed down from one generation to the next orally, making everybody have to remember more history than maybe we do naturally. And while that is great, if you stop passing it on, that history is lost. And so then somebody has to take it upon themselves to record that history in a way that those of us who are a bit lazier have access to it because someone else has done all the hard work, and we can, read their hard work and enjoy the fruits of their labor and become more knowledgeable from it and more empathetic, hopefully, as well. And so I think that is one thing that really stood out to me when I read Saz's book. And I'd love to introduce to all of you Saz Agarwal. Saz is a writer and a painter who lives in Pune, India. Her book, Sindh, Stories from a Vanished Homeland, which I have right here, and I highly recommend to everybody because it is a beautiful, beautiful read, gives a glimpse, it takes the reader to Sindh and gives a glimpse to the reader of what life was like pre, during, and just after the time of partition. It's really a heartfelt read, and we'll get into this today. But when I read it for the first time, I thought this sounds like something very personal that became larger and larger. And I learned from my conversation with Saz before that is in fact what happened. It was something that started very personally that became larger. So without further ado, Saz, good evening, and thank you so much for being here with me this evening.
Hi, Ragini. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you. It's so nice to see you, and so glad that we can have this. I think today the Sindhis are synonymous, at least with the Bombay business sort of scene in Bombay. You always think of Sindhis and you think of various types of businesses that are known to be Sindhi businesses, especially so in Bombay, if not in many other parts of North India as well. But I think what I'm really interested to hear from you is why that is, how that came to be, and where else in the world that is. So maybe you could start by just sharing with us a little bit about your background, the motivation for your work, and the real drive to record the Sindhi story in quite so much detail.
So can I share my screen, and I'll just show you, start with, this is how it started. And I'm basically a writer, and I specialize in helping people write their memoirs. So actually this happened soon after my father died, and my mother was alone, and I wanted her to feel wanted. I wanted her to feel, that there was something important, and that we wanted to hear from her. So I said, why don't you tell me about your childhood in Sindh and let me write it down? And none of us knew, nobody in the family knew anything about it. So she very sportingly would come to and sit down in front of me and talk to me and tell me that this is who we are, this is what it was like back then. And it took me, I think on the second day I knew, because she was 13 years old when partition took place. And I was so amazed that she remembered so much without ever having spoken about it. 65 years had passed. Mm-hmm. And nothing. We never, I mean, the very faintest of scraps sometimes, but there was no proper knowledge of the kind of life they'd lived. And she remembered everything. It gave me goose flesh, really. It was something which moved me a lot. I realized that this is something which she'd always put aside because, I suppose, because nobody was interested. But it wasn't just that. It was also that there was so much that was really interesting. I was just fascinated. And I knew that I can't just stop with my mother's story. I have to interview other people to give a more rounded picture. And I did. And that's how this book came about. It's a collection of stories from people with different representative aspects of Sindh just before, during, and just after Sindh, after partition. And I also read a lot of books, and I've used excerpts from secondary sources, which should give you, either they validate what the person has said, sometimes they contradict what the person has said, but that's really nice because with history, you never really know exactly what happened. And I think it's nice for the reader to make their own decisions. And, so for me, it just became something that I love doing. And I'm still doing it. I'm doing it as fast as I can now because we're losing the migrant generation. And most of those who we have now, like my mother, who is no more, sadly, most of them were children at the time of partition. So their perspective is different from, if they were the ones who'd actually left, we'd have heard, who actually packed their bags and brought their families, we'd have heard different stories. But I think this is the best we can do now. And as I said, I'm doing it I had a target before lockdown of doing 2 a week. That's a bit too ambitious now, but I'm still doing it.
That's so true. I mean, it's so obvious now that you say it, but I don't think I'd ever explicitly thought that the stories would be so different if we heard them from the people who, like the adults of the time, as opposed to the children.
They saw things differently. They understood history differently. And their experiences were different. Like what I realized from my mother, I realized the kind of person that she was. Partly it was because as a child, she went through this phase where she saw her parents were anxious and they were frightened and they did not know what was going to happen. And there was this force which was trying, which was against them, which they were fleeing. And those were things that affected her. And she was, I understood that was why she was who she was.
Right. Absolutely. In fact, just the other day after, I think maybe after the first or second day, I was speaking with my own mother, who is, whose parents also left as children. And she said the same thing. She was like, what we haven't really unpacked is the intergenerational impact it had on who people became because of what they saw, and therefore who their children became because of who they were, And I think that's
all the time, that residue, certain habits, which you've inherited because people, faced what they did face.
Can you share with us perhaps one small anecdote before we move into the questions about the community, but one small anecdote from your mother?
About her life in Sindh, or just about, okay, let me quickly tell you something. So she was a very rational person. She was an atheist and she was a thinker. But this happened in Pune, where I live, and I'd taken her with me to attend an event with a group of women. And we'd gone to Empress Gardens, which is this fabulous botanical garden, very old and very beautiful place in Pune, old trees. And the person who arranged this event, she'd got the trustee of the garden to come and talk to us about it, tell us about the history. So we were all sitting there, and he said, "Do I have your permission to say a prayer before we start?" So obviously everybody said yes, and he started. And he began reciting a verse from the Quran. And my mother started coughing. And she was very, very embarrassed. But her coughing, she was so choked up. And, everybody was like, there's this old woman who's having a coughing fit, and they gave her water. And, it was all okay. But to me, it was that hear someone who the sound of a prayer, a holy prayer, holy words, peaceful, beautiful words is disturbing because of the symbolism. And I felt so bad about that. But you know, that's a fact.
Right, right. Yeah. Yeah. That's, yeah.
I don't think anyone noticed that. And it might just have been a coincidence.
Would if they didn't know her.
I think it might have just been a coincidence, but this is how I interpreted it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So let's start. And I think we have a beautiful reading that you might do for us.
So this is from Aruna's story. Aruna Jetwani, she might just be in the audience because I sent her the message this is going to happen. Okay. And it's called We Have Assimilated Beautifully. I'm just going to read you one verse. One paragraph. I distinctly remember the embroidery on one frock and the floral print on the other. The two new dresses I was wearing on that historic journey, one on top of the other. Just to tell you this, that why was she wearing one dress on top of the other? It's because they couldn't carry things. They had to wear, layers of clothes so that they could carry them with them. I also remember the mock looting of our black tin trunk. It held no treasure, only a few changes of clothes for the four of us. The railway platform in Hyderabad was crowded. People traveling by this train had been robbed and stripped of all their belongings. But our trunk was opened merely as a charade. As the tall, hefty Pathan with large black eyes and equally large black whiskers opened the trunk, he caught sight of the photograph of Sai Sayyid Malik, a Muslim Peer, right on top. In reverence, he offered a prayer, closed the trunk, and ordered his men to see us to our compartment. My grandmother and her whole family swore by the miracles of Sai Malik. This was not uncommon then. Many Sindhi Hindus were followers of Sai Satchal, Sai Bedal, and other Muslim Sufi saints.
Thank you. Thank you for reading that. Beautiful.
So another miracle by Sai Malik.
Malik, yeah, beautiful. So can you take us to Sindh of pre-partition? What was it like? What did people do? How did the religious factions live together? What constituted the Sindhi identity?
So, since I started with this slightly negative, the impact that it had on my mom, and then we did this little piece about how Sayyid Malik saved this family. Okay, before we start, this is a little bit of what Sindh looks like. I may come back here and show you. This is Hyderabad and this is Karachi. And we'll come back here and I'll show you the place again. This is when we went to Sindh in 2013. I went with my family. We actually went to launch the book, Stories from a Vanished Homeland. It was published by the Oxford University Press. And they released it at the Karachi Literature Festival, and we went for that. Now, one of the days we were hosted by Mushtaq Talpur. He sent us to this village, which is largely Hindu. And that was very surprising for us because we were under the impression that all the Hindus had left Sindh. But these people, the Hemrajani family, they explained to us that in 1947, the tribal leader of their area said, look, you don't go anywhere. I'm here. I'll take care of you. And he did. And that succession, his son and his grandson have continued the same thing of, it's not about what religion you are. You belong here. And so we spent the day with them. We actually went to a temple. We ate prasad and we had a meal in their home, which was so good because it was exactly like the food my grandmother used to cook. We got a sense of how joint families lived in Sindh because there were 6 brothers living in the same house, and there was a marriage. And because there was a marriage going to happen very soon, they were having 2 marriages and one engagement and 2 thread ceremonies, and everything was going to be done together because everybody was coming, and that's the way it usually was done with joint families. So here, this is the tomb of Raja Vikramjit, who left everything and became a saint. He gave up his worldly life and he took to religion. Now, it looks like a dargah, but it also has these very tangible symbols of Hinduism and Sikhism. And these were the main influences of people in Sindh. I think I've interviewed a lot of people who call themselves Hindus, but if you probe a little bit, you find that their religious instruction comes from the Guru Granth. They say, no, we are not Sikh, we are Hindus. Mm-hmm. But everything they do is from the teachings of Guru Nanak, and they go to the Gurdwara. They have their rituals, their functions, their death rituals. Everything is at the Gurdwara. But they say, no, we are Hindus. So it's quite interesting. And also many families have Sufi peers. Not so much now, but some of the older generation, they still remember going to the Peer's village every year and spending time there, and certain in fact, even now, the people who've inherited the Gadda, they still have a little temple in their homes, and the followers, hereditary followers, still go to them. I have a friend who does that.
Wow. It's so we see in the back of this picture Hinduism and what looks like Urdu script. You can tell me if that's Sindhi, but
it's probably Sindhi, yeah.
So would that be looks to me like a very,
it looks like an Arabic script.
Yeah, and it looks multi-religious just from looking at it. There are very clear symbols. So what would that say? Is that a Sindhi prayer, and where did those?
It's definitely a Hindu prayer, and it's in the Sindhi language, which is has a lot of influence from. Sindhi is a very old language, so there's always a debate about whether Sanskrit came first or Sindhi came first. But there's a lot which both the languages have in common. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of influence also from Persian.
Right.
Yeah, there are Persian words, and because in the Indus Valley, that area was a part of the Persian Empire.
And it's not the Arabic script, right? Like Sindhi is its own script.
It has its own script, which is derived from, they call it the Perso-Arabic script.
Okay.
And it's not that much used in India. A lot of people, Sindhi itself is not, although it's one of the languages of the Indian Constitution, it doesn't have a huge population of people who read and write, although there's still a lot of people who speak it. But reading and writing, I think that's true for most Indian languages, though. But it is, there's government support for Sindhi language also, and literature. We also, in India, we have Sindhi written and read in Devanagari, as well as in the Roman script. So there's a full convention, very elaborately scientifically done, which has transliterated a lot, every alphabet and many of the words into.
And was that something that happened post-partition, or is it quite?
Absolutely. Before partition, there was nothing like that.
Oh, wow.
It's all this script. And after partition, first of all, Sindhi was not it was not an Indian language. When the Constitution was written, Schedule 8, Sindhi was not one of the languages of India. And I think most people were okay with that, but there was this huge body of writers and intellectuals who were furious. We've lost our land and now our language is gone. It was absolutely trauma. So they took the matter to court, and of course it was fought by the inimitable Ram Jethmalani, and of course he won. But that happened only in 1967. So we're talking about 20 years lost. That's 2 generations, if you look, more than 1 generation anyway, of school children who never got to learn Sindhi. And so that's the thing. In India, there's very little about the language, but I'll just quickly show you this about the religion. Mm-hmm. This is the Hindu temple in Malaga, which you can see is very much a Hindu temple, except for this one wall, which has, the prophets of other religions. And this is in Spain. And this is in Panama, in South America. And it's a bit smudgy, but on the left, there's an altar of the Black Christ. And you can see a gentleman up there. He's no more, unfortunately, Lakshman Kriplani. He was one of the people who took me there. And when we entered the church, and I went as a tourist, but he was a worshipper. He took off his slippers and he climbed up to pay obeisance at the shrine. And it was so, such a very Sindhi thing to do. First of all, I don't think many people take off their shoes when they worship in a church. And that was a Hindu thing. But also being so worshipful in a place of worship, which is not technically the religion you were brought up with. I think that's a very Sindhi thing to do. And I think it comes from Sindh, where you're not really, putting any boundaries on it's not that you believe in a higher code or you believe in existence. And it's fine, the interpretations may vary, but you'd always respect what.
How did that come to, I'm sure it's much longer, but if you had to sort of summarize, how did that come to be? And were there any points at which the Sindhi community belonged overwhelmingly to one religion without the influences? When I say belonged, I mean in the way that you describe, where people took the best parts perhaps of multiple religions.
Yeah, it's very hard to, make this kind of an assessment, but I think it started with the majority Buddhist, a lot of Buddhism, and that it was like that in large parts of India. Buddhism was the most prevalent religion until, Hinduism began making its way back. And then in Sindh, the Arabs came in. I think that would have been the 8th century. But before that, it was almost wholly Buddhist. And why? I think Sindh has just been a place where the religions have intermingled, and there's been a lot of acceptance, partly probably because of the nature of the conquests, and also because, when you try to convert with violence, it doesn't work. That's what happened in India. Islam was making headway until Ghazni and Gori and, all that happened. After that, there was resistance. But before that, Islam was very much a part of increasing gradually. I think that's one thing that happened in Sindh. I don't know. I think there are a lot of religious people. I'm sure that was there in other parts of India also. I know Bengal is like that, where there are these wandering minstrels. Sindh and probably Punjab too. I mean, it's probably all over India. But Sindh, there's, they say Sawa Lakh Peer in Rohiri, which is, 1,25,000. That's, I think, just a metaphor for every second person is a peer.
And just going back to the written script for 1 second, is that more popular in the province of Sindh, which is now in Pakistan? Is the written script still more popular there?
So it's a very sad story, because the Hindus left and they lost, their culture and their religion. Now, the people who were left, the majority, which is largely Muslim, they were colonized by the new migrants. And the people who were in positions of power, who had wealth, they were the Hindus. So suddenly they were gone. And they were replaced by outsiders who actually became, in charge. So the Sindhis, and then I think in the 1950s, early 50s, they declared something called one unit, that we're one country, we will have one language. And that didn't work out very well, because in Bengal and Sindh, they have a very strong literature and philosophy. So it wasn't such a great idea to try. It became a colonization of the people. And there was, I think, one generation which lost their language. It came back in the early 70s. And now, there's a lot of Sindhi nationalism. So there is passion for the language. Like I say, in India, we may have lost Sindhi, but Sindhi is alive and well and being nourished, and people are writing in Sindh.
That's so important that it is alive in that way. And what was Sindh under the British. So when we had a conversation about Lahore a few nights ago, one of the themes that came out, and we know this of the British Raj, is this element of, you know, turning factions that at one point lived quite harmoniously together against one another. Can you speak briefly to the dynamics of that in the Sindh? It was also annexed, and so the Sindh under the British?
I think that the divisions were, I mean, you know, they weren't so incisive because there was a lot of fellow feeling and togetherness, but the differentiations definitely were implemented. You know, like I say to you that people say that we are Hindu, but actually they are Sikh. Their whole thinking is Sikh. They don't wear the 5 symbols of Sikhism,
right?
But their philosophy, religious philosophy, is very much Sikh. But they'll never say that we are Sikh, because I think this is from the British, in the, you know, filling census forms or whatever, where they say that we are Lohanas, and nobody knows what a Lohana is. It's like quite vague, you know. And we're Hindu. But actually, yeah, we are Hindu, but we follow the Sikh religion and we follow Sufi Pir. So, you know, about what happened with the British is that the Hindus, a lot of Hindus took to education under the British, and they started working in the British administration, and they started doing well. The traders also, who were mostly Hindu, they learned how to, you know, adapt themselves to the economy, the changed economy brought by the British. So that's what happened. The Hindus flourished in Sindh under the British.
And I think that takes us nicely to our next topic, which is, you know, Sindhis and trade, Sindhis and business. They sort of, these are.
But before that, I'll just tell you about this picture. You might be surprised to hear that I found it in Chennai, in a place called Sufidar. And it's run by Sindhis, and it was started by Dada Ratan Chand, who was actually a Sindhwarki. And I'm going to explain to you in a minute what a Sindhwarki was or is. And, you know, it's very much a Sufi place. And a lot of Sindhis are actually quite right-wing, but this is the origin. This is what they were in Sindh. So talking about trade, you said that, yeah, Sindhis are largely a mercantile community,
which
there's a long history.
Well before, you know, that goes back very, very far in history. So, and we spoke a little bit when we talked about the community going far and wide, and how then that helped them when 1947 took place. So
yeah. So first, I'll tell you about this network, which is older. There are 2 networks coming out of Sindh, and funnily enough, they were documented quite recently by a French researcher called Claude Markowitz, which suddenly brought everything out into the open. And he stumbled on these completely by chance in the course of other research he was doing. So this is an image which is called Shikarpuri Bankers, and I don't know who painted it or what school it's from, but looking at it, it is probably what Shikarpuri Peri looks like. If you look at all these ledgers, which you can see the writing, they account books and the customer sitting in front. So I'm just going back to the map, and you can see Shikarpur up here. It's in the north, near the frontier, near Balochistan. And this is Rohiri, which I was telling you about, Sawa Lakh Pir.
Right.
And here is Hyderabad, which is the other place which I'm going to be telling you about in a bit. And here's Karachi. So Shikarpur, and you've got Multan somewhere over here, which is in Punjab. And a lot of these people were actually in Multan. And because it was an important place on the trade route coming from Central Asia and going towards Persia. And towards the end of Aurangzeb's reign, things were falling apart. The Mughal Empire was falling apart, and a lot of chieftains were declaring themselves as rulers of their own provinces and so on. So it was all very unsettling, and Multan was not a great place to live. So a lot of people packed up and went to Shikarpur, and that became a base of what they were doing before in Multan. And they gathered there. It's like Claude Markowitz, who he calls it the Banya melting pot, because people came from various places and they set up. What they were doing is they were servicing the caravans, and they had this banking business where they were giving loans and they were dealing in foreign exchange. And the most interesting thing, of course, is the hundi, which is a promissory note. So you could cash in a hundi anywhere on this long route, which was such a big facility for a trader, who had a lot of money, who sold a lot of goods and didn't travel on this bandit-infested route with that money. He could just leave it with somebody and collect it somewhere else, or even leave it with somebody and his family could collect the money back in Shikarpur. So this was something which is like a sophisticated banking system. And after partition, a lot of them already had their paidees in South India. So you will find, Coimbatore, Salem, Erode, Bangalore have a lot of Shikarpuri. They were in the banking business. Some of them still are, but they are also branched out into other businesses. The other thing,
along this route, were all of the bankers Sindhi along the route? Yeah,
they were Shikarpuri bankers from the same families. Boys would go and set up their shop there. There were communities where they had their own, for example, crematorium, because Hindus have a ritual to cremate, to burn their dead, which is, in these regions, it was something which was different. It was something which was considered weird, and sometimes they would try to stop them. But that's what they did. That was the Hindu way, and that's what they did. Wow. And yeah, they were all the way to Russia, I think.
Oh, wow.
In fact, that's how Claude Markowitz discovered this. He found these records of bankers who died intestate and correspondence between the Russian court and their families in Shikarpur.
Wow. That's fascinating. And that was all in translated from Russian?
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Really fascinating.
So there was another trade route which happened when the British came in. And when the British came into Sindh, obviously, first of all, they knocked out the princes. And so, the whole royalty was gone, which means that for the traders, their chief customers were finished. So, who was going to buy their stuff? Secondly, they brought in the company rupee. So even those who were dealing in money, their business was gone. So they went through a very difficult time. But at some point, they discovered that the British themselves love the handicrafts of Sindh. And they buy them. And when they're going on home leave, they fill their trunks with Sindh work, as they called it. And they put them on the steamer and push off. So soon enough, these young boys of Sindh filled up their own trunks with Sindh work and got on the ships. And that's why they're called Sindhwarkis, because they dealt in Sindh work, and they took their goods to the ports and they'd sell them there. So they'd start from Karachi to Bombay, and then Aden, which is in Yemen, and then on to Cairo, and then Gibraltar, and then Spain, the Canary Islands. And all the way to South America, I met someone in Punta Arenas, which is near the South Pole, whose father came there in 1907.
Wow.
He was the first Sindhi there. And, it's a very difficult journey around that Cape, all these blizzards and icebergs. And then they come to this beautiful green and calm and lovely place. So you kind of stumble off the ship and say, hey, now I'm not leaving.
They were better traveled a century ago than most people.
His life was 6 months on a ship because he was bringing his goods from Japan. Eventually, this is what he used to do. He would go to Japan on the way. If they were going from the east, he would stop in Karachi. And of course, in those days, the ships would stop at every port for a decent amount of time. He'd have time to go and meet his family in Hyderabad and then come back and then go to Japan And if he was coming back on the same route, he could meet his family again a few weeks later. 6 months, 3 months going, 3 months coming, and then 6 months in Punta Arenas.
So they didn't.
Sorry?
They didn't often take their families with them?
Not at first. At first, it was mostly the boys. Of course, the first lot were the entrepreneurs themselves. And then when they became Seths, they would stay at home and they would hire out young boys to go and do the work for them. And they lived in a little room above the shop. They did their own housework, and it was quite a hard life. They would get to go home every 2 or 3 years. Some of them did take their wives and families. So this is Gibraltar, and this store was established according to the sign in 1858. And Diyaldas, Bhai Pratap Diyaldas, his father started this company, M. Diyaldas, and they opened in Gibraltar in 1890. And this is the map. It's a map which is based on Claude Markowitz's findings. If you look at the names of the places on this map, every one of them had a little company owned by a Sindhi with its head office in Hyderabad, Sindh. So they were there everywhere. And in 1947, these were trade outposts, all that while from 1860 to 1947. In 1947, when the Hindus left from Hyderabad, Sindh, they had a place to go. Many of them had family in these places. So those trading outposts became communities because the wives and the children also came. And now, 70 years later, many of them have integrated locally. They still retain, they're still very passionate about being Sindhi. Most of them cook Sindhi food at home. I ate a lot of Sindhi food when I went to South America.
So just one.
And I also ate Indonesian food when I went to South America, because you have Sindhi families who had, they'd come from Indonesia because, for example, a Sindhi woman in Indonesia, she gets married to this guy in Chile because it's an endogamous community, right? So they look for matches within the community. And it's very clear that it's fine where you live. You don't know which country you're going to marry into. You might move. So yeah, I ate Indonesian food as well. So
Indonesian food in a Sindhi household in South America.
Yeah.
And so do the colors on the map tell us anything, or are they just...
No. This is a magazine picked up that Claude Markowitz map and just put applications. I haven't really looked at the colors, but it's nothing to do with the Sindhi diaspora.
And one other question I had about the diaspora is, was there much, we've talked about, folks whose families were back in Sindh and then maybe they joined them later, but was there any or much integration in terms of intermarriage with all of these various tradesmen going around the world?
Yeah, of course there was. Of course there were. I have met people who are, their father was Sindhi and their mother was a local person. Mm-hmm. It was not common, but it happened. And of course, there were men who'd have mistresses. And how could that not be? It's because they were living away from their homes for 2 or 3 years. And yeah. I don't think it was very common. It wasn't a done thing. By and large, it was like you go home and the next time you go home, you see your child for the first time. Yeah.
Wow. So, where is the place that you were most perhaps surprised by that? I didn't know there was a community here as well.
I think South America was a real. It was a surprise because for us in India, we don't really have ties, and we don't have, even though it's not as, it's the same distance for us as the US, it just feels a lot further away. Yeah. And I loved it that I had this book club in Iquique. It's a free trade zone. There was this bunch of women, about 25 women, each of them had my book. So that was a very happy moment for me.
That's awesome. So were there any of these spots that were particularly popular in 1947 that a lot of Sindhis went to at that time?
So Africa was big. I think, you had a lot of Gujaratis also there, but they were on the other coast. And I know there was this Chela Ram, who was one of the pioneering Sindhwarkis. His company went into the interiors of Africa. So they were actually they helped in the development of rural Africa, and in the sense that they were taking products inside. People in the interiors were grateful to have those products. There's this thing someone told me once, that when Nehru visited Nigeria, he was introduced to the president as this man chief of Chela Ram's country.
Wow, that's awesome.
So this is Leela, which is Moinani business in Santiago, Chile. And Leela is Tulsi Moinani's mother. So it's named after her.
After her.
Yeah. So yeah, as I said, they were largely a mercantile community, though there were so many who were professionals. There were so many who were working in the government administration and revenue collection and the judiciary. But after partition, many of those people, even who were not business people, they got into trading just to stay afloat, and just so that they could earn something and support their families without taking handouts. Because I think most of us are like that, right? We'd rather support ourselves. We don't want to be beholden to anyone. So I think the Sindhis were very particular about that. They didn't want, they wanted to do things their own way. They wanted to regain their lives of dignity and comfort as soon as possible. And trading was a way to do it. And, I showed you this Dialdas poster. Bhai Pratap, he was one of those people who petitioned the government of Bombay to allow hawkers, to give them licenses so that they could sell things in the trains and they could set up stores.
Wow.
And they were given. I mean, those concessions were given. So the government did look after them. The government didn't do everything for them, and they'd lost their homes. So, whatever you did wouldn't have been enough. But there were things like, even for housing, I think, let me wait and let you ask me what you want. I'm just going on, I'm rambling on and on.
No, it's so interesting. But I mean, I think now we can sort of move kind of into that. So Bombay today is fairly, synonymous with, when you think of Sindhis in India, you first think of Bombay. And so can you maybe describe that resettlement in Bombay, Kalyan, Pune, Delhi? How did the community stay together? Now that the land was gone, how did the community stay together? And then we can move into retention of identity after that, but maybe just describe them.
Here you can see that they're all over the world, and they are little Sindhi populations everywhere. And, I told you about the book I wrote that was in 2012. And it's an actual book which has been read by quite a lot of people. It's in university libraries. And I feel a little embarrassed when I think about how little I knew when I actually wrote that book. But obviously it didn't have any, anything wrong in it. I mean, in the sense of anything inaccurate, no false notes. But in these 8 years, I've continued to read and interview people and think, and I am learning new things every day. And it's really surprising. There's so much, and it's so interesting, and the journey is still going on. So here you can see people all over the world, but it's true that there are more Sindhis in Bombay and second in Pune than in any of these small communities. And I'm going to show you this picture, which is my mom's cousin. If you've read the book, then you'll know her. Her name is Laji, and she features in the book. And her father was a Mukhtiarkar in Sindh. And Mukhtiarkar was a senior administrative officer. Higher than that, you had to be British. So you couldn't get promoted beyond Mukhtiarkar. And they lived in a lovely bungalow on the hill and whatever. a very comfortable lifestyle. But when partition came, they didn't think that they were going to leave, because Sindh had not been partitioned. And the reason was that they assumed that this small Hindu population, which had always been comfortable as a minority, would continue. But it didn't happen like that, because there was a transfer of population and they were booted out, basically. So they had to escape. And when they did, they landed up in Ahmedabad, where they had a cousin. And he had actually not left his job, because they were watching him. They didn't want him to go. And he sent his family off and he escaped. And he reached there. So it was known that he'd left Pakistan, and the Indian government wanted him because he was an expert at certain areas of administration, and they wanted him. They needed people like that. So they had to find him. And, at a time when communication was not what we know today, how they found him was through radio announcements. And they were announcing for Mr. Choitram Bijlani. There must have been others. I mean, obviously, he wasn't the only one. There must have been a system by which every day or maybe once a week, they would call out the names of people who were wanted by the government in Delhi. And one of his cousins heard his name, and he knew he was in Ahmedabad, and he said to him, "There's a job waiting for you with the government. Go to Delhi right away." And he did. And he worked in Delhi until he retired early, because his son, Birma, had got a job as a pilot with Air India. And he said, "Now I want you to come. Enough, you've worked all your life. I'm going to look after you." And he got him to retire early. And when I showed Laji this photo, my Laji auntie, she just told me this story yesterday when I showed her the photo and told her that, I found this and I thought it's so lovely. Look at that spirit and look at the place. And this is Mulund. And Mulund is completely different now. If anyone, if you go to Mulund, you're not going to see a hillside and a tree. You're going to see buildings and tenements, and you're going to see a lot of traffic. So, and in the back, there's a building which I don't know what it is exactly, but it does look like an army structure. And they were army camps which were converted for the people who had come, homeless people, and who were being accommodated. And many of these later over the years were converted into homes. And here's another picture from Mulund, from one of the refugee camps. And this lady, her name is Savitri. Her name was Savitri at the time. Later, she got married and she became Nalini Advani. But here, she was 17 years old. And what happened is, in the refugee camps, there were all these children whose schooling had been interrupted. And their parents were anxious to get them back to school. But where? They were in this remote place. And in any case, even if they could make arrangements for them to commute to a school, they couldn't afford it, and the schools were all full. So they took this room on which it's scribbled Standard 8, but this was the first room which was given to them. And the children came and sat on the floor. There were 3 volunteer teachers, one of whom was this girl. And they started, at the end of 1 month, they collected fees from the children's parents. And then over time, they were able to buy furniture. And this school today is called the Navbharat School, and it has, junior college, and it has 8,000 students.
Wow.
So that's how it started, as one room for the refugee children. There's another story which I just love. This is he's Principal Kundanani. So shall I tell you this? Do we have time?
Yes, please do.
But just stop me because, once I start, I need you to tell me that's it. Or, if you have another question and I'm going on, just signal me because,
You're good. Tell us the story. It's an interesting one.
Yeah. So he was a professor at the DG National College in Hyderabad, Sindh. And, you read about that place. I've seen pictures. It was recently renovated for their 100th year, and it looks lovely. They had the river flowing by it, but now it's not a river anymore. Unfortunately, the river, it was the Puleli. It used to be, which is a canal of the Indus. Apparently now it's not much of a stream anymore. It's a bit of a muddy rivulet, if I'm not mistaken. But how would I know? Because it's across the border. So he was a professor at the National College in Hyderabad. And when partition happened, before partition, the colleges and schools were all closed because it was a situation of lawlessness. There was, you couldn't let a child out of the house. You didn't know what was going to happen. So eventually in November, the college opened, and very few, like only one child came back on the first day, and there was like 10 professors. So nothing was happening because the Hindus were leaving. And Professor Kundanani, he knew he'd have to leave. So he decided to take his college with him. And he packed 2 trunks with laboratory equipment and library books. And he took them to the Hyderabad railway station. And he was helped by a peon of the college who was traveling with him. And it was a very, very dangerous situation because they were stealing and they were taking away things that didn't belong to them. And they were Hindus in a place where Hindus were in danger. But at the station, when the guards asked what's inside these trunks, apparently Kundanani said, there's treasure in these trunks. And the peon says that the guards jumped on the trunks and opened them. And when they found books, they felt disgusted and said, fine, take it. So he put them in the train and he crossed the border and he somehow got them to Bombay. And in Bombay, he was staying with family members. And I interviewed somebody, Kishu Mansukhani, who was a child in the same house. And he told me that Kundanani used to leave the house in the morning. And he said, we didn't know where he was going, but we knew that he was looking for a place to start his college. And every Sunday he would sit down with a pile of postcards and he'd write. And he'd write to his former colleagues. And they were all over India. They were in different places. And he'd write to them. And every week he'd write to all of them and tell them, I'm looking for a place. I'm going to call you. I know you have to work now to support your family. You have to help in your brother's shop, your uncle's shop, or you're making tikkis to sell, or you're giving tuitions. Do that. But I'm going to call you and you're going to get your job back soon. And he did. He did it. He got funding. He found a place. His wife sold her jewelry. He got funding from some Sindh workies, of course, because they were a wealthy lot. And, a lot of what came up in Bombay came from that money. And eventually, who was the first student? The first student was a Muslim. I've forgotten his name. I think it's Shakir Gaya. And when this application came up and his colleagues said, look, we can't take a Muslim. We've been thrown out by the Muslims. Why should we take Muslims in our college? So Kundanani said, hello, this is National College. Do you know what that means? And of course, they took him and he studied in that college and he became a professor in National College as well.
Wow. And this is National College in Bandra, which is... That's
right, Bandra National College. And as it so happens, my parents were students there. My mom was, she was a very bright student. And though her family lived in South Bombay, and she should have gone to Jai Hind College or Xavier's, but my grandfather said Kundanani's college is new and he needs good students. So for like 5 years, she commuted to National College, and it's a good thing she did because that's where she met my dad. And if she hadn't, I wouldn't be here.
Wow.
So this is my favorite person. I mean, look at this. This is actually funny. This photo is from my dad's album. It says Kannada Association. So it was really a national college. They had a Kannada Association. You can see the banner, right?
Yeah. Wow, that's such an incredible story. And
right.
Thank you.
So yeah, this is part of the historic laboratory equipment and the books from National College, DG National College in Hyderabad.
Wow, that's really something. And to think that National College is literally a kilometer from where I'm sitting right now. incredible history behind it. It's just, yeah, incredible.
And it looks, I mean, you know, I knew my parents had studied there and they'd met there. And I lived down the road from there as well for some years. And I always thought it was this really boring and ugly place. But it has such a fabulous history.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I also wanted to, you know, I have this picture which I wanted to show you because when the Sindhis came to, you know, after partition, housing was very difficult. Everybody needed a home. And in those days, they had a system by which you had wealthy people who owned buildings and they gave you place on rent. And the rent happened through something called pagri, which was basically money. Untaxed money, which was a large sum, was given to the landlord. And then you lived there on a very small rent. So that was the traditional system, which didn't work because most people came without money. They, you know, they had to just run off, left everything. So eventually what happened was people who had money, the government introduced, you know, ways which made it easier for them to get loans and you know, to get permission to build. So people built homes for themselves, and they would build these, like, you know, Bandra's full of these buildings with just 6 floors and, you know, 3 flats or 2 flats on each floor. So they would build for themselves and then they'd sell at cost to their friends and family. So they'd have good neighbors and people had homes. So that's how it started. And once they'd done it, they were experienced and it was a great way to earn money. So many of them just kept going. And a lot of the buildings in Bombay are built by, they started like that. You know, the educational institutes, as I said, some of Bombay's hospitals as well. And a lot of Bombay's construction has these roots.
Wow. Wow. Thank you for that. That's, yeah.
And then I must tell you this, you mentioned about keeping the community together and, you know, the bonds. So I think the main thing that has been retained within families is the food. And Sindhi families usually eat Sindhi food. Of course, they eat all kinds of other menus also, but there's always traditional sai bhaji and you know, sial mutton and various like traditional things, which, so they lost a language. Even the music is unfamiliar to the younger generation. No, nobody knows anything about poetry and philosophy. Absolutely gone. No poetry, no philosophy. It was replaced by, you know, shiny handbags, designer handbags and diamonds and things like that, which I suppose is okay. I mean, you know, you make your choices.
And just before we, I mean, you're speaking straight to my heart. Obviously, I love learning about how the food has traveled with it. And I assumed it was something that kept the community together. But it's lovely to hear that it was actually one of the few cultural things that has stood
strongly retained. Yeah.
Yeah. But just coming to the philosophy and the music for a second, is that something that is preserved in the province of Sindh?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's this, I recently, somebody who I know, Dharmendra Tolani, he's a software engineer who lives in Hyderabad. He told me this, that when Telenor came to Pakistan, they had this ad campaign in which, and I clicked on the link and I saw this beautiful song and the background of Sindh, and it was based on Shah Abdul Latif's poetry. So, you know, if an ad campaign can be based on something and it's so popular and it's so fabulous, that tells you it's very, very deep within the community. But in India, it's not there at all. I mean, we listen to Kabir, we listen to Rumi, and of course, the philosophy is very similar. And as in, you know, I mean, the concepts are similar. Shah Abdul Latif actually is somebody who is said to have enriched the vocabulary of Sindh to such an extent that he's sometimes compared with Shakespeare.
Oh, wow.
The words and the concepts that he used, which became a part of the daily life and the thought process of the Sindhi people.
That's really fascinating. And I've really been struck as you've been talking that, you know, your book is called Stories from a Vanished Homeland. And it's so much more than geography. I mean, it is.
I want to tell you why it's called Vanished Homeland.
Please.
So on the second day, I think, when my mom started talking to me, she said that our families come from 5 villages near Larkana. And my father's village is Herodero, and then you have Naodero. I think that's where the Bhutta family comes from. Then you have Rattodero, then you have Panjodero, and she couldn't remember the 5th one. And so she thought, and she said, you know, I'm really sorry, I can't remember. And the sad thing is that there's nobody left whom I can ask. So while she was saying that, I keyed it in, I put in my Google taskbar and I did enter, and then I read out the other names. And, you know, when I said Banguldero, she was like, oh my God, how could you possibly know that? And I'm like, listen, it's a place and a map. All you need is a map, right? If it's a place. And that's when it struck me that if you're 13 years old and you leave your home and you never go back and nobody talks about it, all those places have gone forever, you know. So that's why I use the word vanished.
I'm so glad I said that. I'm so happy to have heard that story just as we're finishing. Thank you so much for sharing that. Our hour has flown by as I expected it would. So I might just quickly take a couple of questions that have come through as you've been regaling us with Tales of Sindh. So the first question is, somebody has asked, is there a significance to the Ani phenomenon in Sindhi naming culture? Because obviously so many names end with Ani. And so does it mean something, or where does it come from?
So I think it's not just Sindhis. You see Ani in other communities also, in Kachis and Gujaratis and I mean, in Italy as well, I think. But I think it means it's like it indicates your provenance. So if you're, for example, from if you are named for an ancestor called Vadhumal, then you're Vadhwani. If you're named for Bijal, you know, you have an ancestor called Bijal, then you become Bijlani, and so on. Yeah.
Okay. That's awesome. It's so logical. There's nothing really mystical about it at all. Yeah.
No, nothing mysterious. Yeah.
Yeah. And then somebody has asked about the Sindhi folk tales. They've given the name of one, Sasi Punhu.
I think, you know, I think it's so easy to find. You can look, you can Google it. And did they want me to tell the story? Because I'm
asking, is folktale something that's still alive?
Oh yeah, very, very much alive in Sindh for sure. Great. In any Sindhi studies course or in any book, or you know, you'll find references.
Yeah,
and lots of I mean, these were told as poetic romances,
right?
Yeah, and they all carry these messages of eternity and, you know, who are we, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. There are lots of messages of thanks coming through for you on the comment section of this video. So just from myself and from everybody in the audience, thank you so much for telling us these tales. Folks, in case you don't have your copy yet, Sindh, Stories from a Vanished Homeland, it's a wonderful book, and there are so few that are accessible to the lay public that I would highly recommend that you go onto Amazon and order your copy.